Welcome to the 100th episode of Writers Radio. I'm Carol Harmon, your host for Radical Acts of Love, How We Find Hope at the End of Life. The author of this book, Janie Brown, has been an oncology nurse in Vancouver for many years. She is the founder of the Callanish Society, which through programs and retreats creates a healing space for people who have been irrevocably changed by cancer. We jump right into a conversation about her work. Janie, you were starting to talk about the challenges that are faced today by people making decisions about end-of-life treatments and when to continue. And I think it's a really difficult time, whether you're a care provider or a patient or family members. In a sense, we're being asked to play God in a way that we didn't used to have to.
We used to rely on the medical profession to play God, but I think now, as you said, we're being put in a position, and saying no sometimes is very difficult to treatments, not really fully understanding what it is you're saying yes to.
Yes.
So I think we're in a really tricky place right now. Say you get a serious diagnosis, right off the bat, whether it's cancer, which is my area of work, or something else, you're immediately thrown into, and usually quite quickly, unless you've had a long drawn out diagnosis, into a system that has its own ways, right, and its own patterns and its own rhythm. And I think that's where I see quite a traumatic response. You're contending not only with the shock of your diagnosis, where you're plucked out of your life, and then you're put into a system that, in a room of 4 people, every bed is curtained, you can hear everything that goes on in the room beside you, there's noises, there's discussion, pretending that we have a private space, but actually the whole thing is public. How do we really take space to say, this is what they're suggesting, this is what they're telling me, and it moves so quickly that, you don't even have a chance to catch up. And then the kind of decisions around treatment, and then when do you listen inside? Is this the right path for me? It's still so directed in a way, and even though we have to make more decisions, there is still a feeling that the direction is outside of us, and we're following along. It all goes into crisis mode, but it isn't really. We have got the time, but we don't take it often to consider these things really deeply. Like, what does this mean to my life, knowing that death kind of sits on your shoulder through the whole conversation and probably wants to say something, but we don't let it in at that point when there's a movement toward treatment, whether it's towards cure or palliation. It's, that death is going, hang on, do you want me in this conversation?
What does death have to say in your experience?
That's a good question. As John O'Donoghue so beautifully says, death came out of the womb with you, and everyone was so excited at your arrival, nobody noticed its presence. And that really moves me.
My goodness, what an incredible quote.
It's true, isn't it? The first breath is connected to the last breath. And so that's how I think of death, in a way, that death is here in every breath. And without being hypothetical about it, it's a terrifying thing for many people. But you can learn to come into a relationship with it. And the more you're around people who are dying and who die, and I've seen many people die, there begins a sense of trust in the intelligence of our natures.
Yes.
In the same way as in birth. You watch a baby being born, you realize the baby is actually following an intelligence. I see it. You see it every time. So in death, I do believe we know what to do, and our bodies know what to do. And that gives me a sense of reassurance and comfort, that we are going to know how to leave this world. If we have the right supports, the right medicines, it requires as they say, a family, a community, really, to do it in a way that can really bring peace and even sometimes joy in the midst of it all, that the sadness and the tragedy of it is there as well. So how do we bring it all together and say, as a community, we know how to do this? And that's where we've been disempowered, I think, by a system that plucks us out so quickly out of our communities and families into a system that is based on expert. And yet, in times gone by, they rely on the intelligence and strength of the community. That's, really why I wrote my book, to try and reassure people that we have what we need. So much of what we need is in our communities, in our families of choice or biological families, that we can rely on people who come from that perspective.
That's a wonderful way of introducing your wonderful book. I've asked you to read a passage from the preface, which really moved me, about witnessing your grand die under the care of your mother at home, as the beginning of a journey that you've had, which has taken you as a nurse from Scotland to Canada and through many, many variations of caring for cancer patients.
Gran was the first person I saw die. I was 19 years old, and she was 81. She was my father's mother, and she lived with our family for the last couple of years of her life in a small cottage attached to the old sandstone house my 3 siblings and I were raised in, just outside Glasgow. Gran died of esophageal cancer, more common in those days because of the heavy cigarette smoking combined with her daily tipples of whiskey. I remember following Mum into Gran's bright white bedroom and watching over her shoulder as she washed my grandmother and changed the soiled sheets. I wanted to help her care for Gran, but I felt frozen, unsure what to do, even though I had worked in hospitals for 2 summers by that time. Gran was my kin, not a patient. That made a difference then. I don't remember being afraid of death, rather just curious about the unusual smells in the room and the fact that she coughed a lot and didn't talk much. Mum made it okay. She didn't seem afraid either, just busy. She had been a nurse too, which must have helped her know what to do. There were no long, heartfelt conversations at Gran's bedside, nor long bucket lists of activities to be accomplished. There was just the work of dying, for my Gran, the patient, and for my Mum, the caregiver. I learned then that most deaths are natural, not easy, but not necessarily scary, nor traumatic or over-medicalized, not romantic nor glorified. Death is most often ordinary and manageable, acceptable, but deeply sad. The majority of old people, like my grandmother, died at home in those days, before it was commonplace to be admitted to a hospital or hospice for the last days or weeks of life. Most people now under 60 have never seen a person die, so have become deeply fearful about death, both their own and the deaths of their beloved others. They've had no role models to show them how to care for a dying person, and therefore no confidence in being able to do so. My hope is that the baby boomer cohort who pushed for the return of the midwives to demedicalize birth will also be instrumental in reclaiming the death process. This book is my contribution to the re-empowering of all of us to take charge of our lives and our deaths, remembering that we know how to die, just as we knew how to come into this world. We also know how to heal and how to settle our lives as best we can before we die. In my view, this is the greatest gift we could give our loved ones, to be prepared and open and accepting when the time comes for us to leave this world.
Your book is about the Callanish Society that you began when?
30 years ago, we had our first retreat in 1997.
What was the impetus for starting that society?
Every vision comes out of a kind of discontent. So I would say that having worked in oncology and cancer care, both in Scotland and then when I moved to Vancouver in '84, working at BC Cancer as an oncology nurse, I felt that we're very disease focused, illness focused, and that's obviously incredibly important. How do we treat this disease in this body? But then, I just kept looking around and spent years looking at families and saying, well, yes, it's a physical illness, but it's also an illness that affects every aspect of your life, really. Your emotional life, your spiritual life, if you have one, your family, your community. So I can remember feeling I just want to expand myself to see this person with this illness in the midst of a community. So when I met Michael Lerner, who's a wonderful friend of mine who started the Commonweal program, they started to run retreats for people with cancer, and really with the same vision, I think. What if we take people, just 8 people together away for a week and give a sort of an exploration, almost a smorgasbord of ways, what he calls healing conditions, which I love. If we set up the conditions for healing, and there are universal ones, there's personal ones, and try and help people land in what is their way, not what I think, as the expert of ways to, what does healing mean to each person? And so I came back to Vancouver, pulled together a team, and just started to run these retreats sort of off the side of my life, my desk, and brought together a group of professionals.
In your spare time.
Yeah, my spare time. We started running retreats and, learning as we went along, but bringing together, we had a physician and nutrition, people who know about food, people who are music and art is a huge part of, I think, how we orient back to ourselves, these ways that we remember ourselves through the creative. Some people have never found their creative self. So, and touch, food, conversation, all of that. So it's a kind of, I would think of it as a holistic program. So every season, we still do this. We run a retreat every season, so 4 to 5 times a year. And by the end of the week, we have people have a stronger sense of themselves. How do I move forward, whether it's towards my death, whether it's hopefully into some sort of remission or some way to live with cancer sometimes for many years. But we have about at least 2/3 to 3/4 of our people are really working with a serious diagnosis. So that's what took me into this new world where I'm very connected to the system, but with this wonderful program. And we have a center in Vancouver now that was given to us to use for ongoing support and counseling and art therapy and events that we do there, just again to support people to find their own healing conditions in a real way.
Your book consists of collections of personal stories on different topics. I hear your voice, but I also hear the voice of the people that have been helped by these programs. It's just incredibly moving to read these real life stories.
I'm glad that comes across. I had to find a balance because some people say, well, this is your story or your quest. So it's a personal, it is that, but it's also what my beautiful friend Maureen, who's from the Cree Nation, said to me. She said, but in our tradition, we call these teaching stories.
It's a very graceful format.
Janie reads from No Talk of Dying, from the chapter Accepting the Unresolved Heart.
Jim, this is Janie, the nurse I told you was coming for tea, she said. I held out my hand and felt a good, strong handshake returned. Good afternoon, Jim said. Sorry to be meeting in here, but I had a bad night. I'll be up and about later. Shona stole a glance at me and raised her eyebrows. Good to meet you, I said. I'll stay for as long as you're up for it. Up for what? Jim asked, his dark, shaggy eyebrows rising with the question. Shona phoned me to see if I could come and meet you, to see if I could help, I said. Help with what? I don't need a shrink if that's what you are. I just need to get out on the course and hit a few balls. I sat down on the chair Shona must have placed at the side of the bed for me. She was perched on a stool at the foot, her legs crossed at the knee, and one sandal wagged up and down in an agitated way. Shona had an agenda. "Jim, darling, be nice. Janie is a nurse and she's from Glasgow," Shona said, patting his foot under the quilt. "I won't hold that against you," Jim said. "Not your fault." He winked. "My dad was born and raised in Ayr, though. Does that help?" I asked. "That's near Largs, where we're both from. Is your dad a golfer?" I knew I'd score some points on the golf. He was a golfer. Got his handicap down to 9 in his best years. And my mum, she lives in Glasgow and still golfs at 86. Dad died almost 20 years ago. "What did he die of, if you don't mind me asking?" Jim said. "A brain tumour, stage 4, when he was diagnosed, out of the blue. My lung cancer is stage 4 too, and I hear there's no stage 5. He looked at me while boxing the air with both fists. I'm a fighter, though, so it's not going to take me out for a good long while. I noticed Jim's pale blue nails and how his chest moved with effort for every breath. I wondered how long it would be until he needed an oxygen tank. Shona slid her agenda into the conversation. "Jimmy, that's not what the doctor said last week. She said she couldn't give you any more chemo, and she was sorry." "Get Janie some tea, darling. She doesn't want to hear you being so negative." Jim shooed her away with a flick of his bony wrist. He started speaking as soon as Shona slipped into the kitchen. "I'm worried about her. What's she going to do when I'm dead? She's not well herself, and the kids are too busy to look in on her. I've taken care of the money side of things, so that's good," Jim said. I took the opportunity while I could. "It'll be hard on her, no question. You can't protect her from her sadness, though, and she's probably stronger than you think. She thinks I don't understand how sick I am, but I do. I just think it's better not to talk about it. Gets her all upset." He dragged his hand through his hair and held onto the back of his neck. "When she gets upset, then I can't hold it together." "Might help her, though, if you could talk about it," I said. "I don't know what to say." He seemed like a man who had relied on his physical and mental strength, but with his diminishing stamina and lowered ability to provide for and protect his wife, he wasn't sure how to adjust to his increasing dependency and the accompanying feelings that were just below the surface. "Here we go," Shona announced, carrying a tray of teacups and saucers, a sugar bowl, milk jug, classic brown Betty teapot, swathed in a knitted tea cosy, and a plate of chocolate digestive biscuits. She set the tray down on the bed, the only clear surface in the room. "What do you take in your tea, Janie?" "Just milk, thanks." She poured the milk in first and then tipped steaming tea into the cup to the brim. "Do you want some tea, Jim?" she asked. "No thanks, darling. I'm already burning up." "What did you two get to talking about in my absence?" Shona asked. Jim looked at me and raised his eyebrows. "We talked about the weather, how mild it is for spring," he said. I sipped my tea. "Is there anything either of you want to talk about or ask me while I'm here?" They looked at each other, waiting to see if the other would respond. Shona tried again. "Jim, I want to talk to Janie about what's going to happen when you get sicker." "What about it?" he asked, his protective armour moving into place. "Are you going to want to be at the hospice or stay here?" she asked. "How many times do I have to tell you? I'm still planning to play another round of golf or two before I kick the bucket." "Let's talk about this another time," Jim said, the frown line between his eyebrows deepening. "Whereabouts in Glasgow are you from, Janie?"
When we were discussing what you should read for this program, you had suggested focusing on the last chapter of the book, which is Liz's story, and it's titled Excruciating Beauty. I think you indicated that there were are some issues in it that you think are really relevant right now?
The title, Excruciating Beauty, I love those two words together. Excruciating is a very strong word for pain and suffering, actually, if you talk about excruciating pain. And then beauty, it's I love the contrast because it's how I feel so much of the time. How could we use beauty as a condition for healing? And can we? I mean, can we even call death or dying beautiful? Well, often it's not. It's often incredibly hard. So in this chapter, I'm trying to describe, this friend who I also worked with for 10 years, who got this serious third cancer diagnosis, actually, when she was just 60, just over 60. And what I wanted to try and describe is what it's like to be a friend, and happen to be a colleague as well, and to watch my own internal dialogue and tension, really, and conflict about what I think of as this kind of pacing. How do we truly meet someone where they are, with our own agendas, with our own wishes and hopes? And so my hopes for her were that our 10 years of working together in this environment with people who were very sick, I so hope that we would right away be able to have these conversations where death is there and we're talking about it. And I very quickly realized that that was not where she was, even with all the experience and even with, her past 2 cancer diagnoses, which maybe did influence actually why she went to the hope. She was, no matter what, she was going to, even though she knew how serious it was. Many of your listeners are probably there too, where you're with a friend and you're having a different conversation inside, which says, I don't know if this is going to go well. And there's a point in that chapter where she is actually kind of demanding me, this is how it felt to me, to hope with her, alongside her. And I think this is a very tricky situation to be in, because how can you be real and authentic when inside you're having a conversation that says, I just want to be having a real conversation? Because of my background as well, I thought, well, I don't know. I mean, it would be a miracle if you got through this, even with treatment. So, but then you don't want to overlay that person's experience with your own worries and fears. So this is where I think relationships are at the core of every process, every situation with someone we love who is facing the end of life. And so this chapter, I'm just trying to get into this, and probably to the realization that I could finally let go of my agenda and really settle with this is her life, and she can choose how she wants to enter into her dying, because we can think of dying as happening the moment we're told that we will not survive this illness, or we can think of dying as being our very last breath. So I happen to have a longer trajectory because I see what people can do in that period of time between knowing you're going to die, which many people don't have that opportunity, who die suddenly or tragically. You have a space of time, and that's the space of time where it can be so fruitful, and it's so difficult, because how do you live with hope and meaning in your life when you have this endpoint? But in fact, we all have an endpoint. It's just that your endpoint, or you roughly know your endpoint. So that this chapter to me has a lot of, I suppose it was the last chapter I wrote, so I had more experience, because some of my chapters are as I developed through my career and my life. As I went along, I learned so much. So this is sort of the final chapter where I feel that I have some personal understanding of how to truly honor the person's journey, their way. You can see often afterwards how directly related it is to who they've been in their life. I'm very interested in, our will to live. We're hardwired for survival. How does that play in when you're told that, your life will be shortened and that you will face the end of your life? So this story is also about, in a way, Liz's will, because she was not going to surrender to this death until she was told that, okay, there's nothing else from the system perspective. And this is someone who had so much experience with cancer treatment. She had 2 previous diagnoses. She was cured. So she has a very different history. The other part about that chapter is the beauty. And I've really developed a deep interest in ceremony in times of real distress. Many cultures know this, and we've lost a lot of our ceremonies. So we're doing much more of that now at Callanish. The last chapter starts with a ceremony that we designed for Liz and Liz's family after she died. We wanted people to bring petals from their gardens and create a mandala, and then to be able to come together and create something beautiful. It was really beautiful to see all the color laid down, from people's lives. And then her husband laid down the ashes on top of these petals. And the color just went out because it just was covered in gray. I still get chills thinking about it. And then basically had asked people if they wanted to take a handful. And again, coming into direct relationship is not something we do very often. Usually ashes are in a box or an urn, or or people are buried, they're not cremated. So he was inviting us into a direct relationship. And I really wanted to write about that to see if I could articulate what that felt like, to hold this, what I call this sort of transmutation of her body in my hand. That story has a lot of themes and I hope teachings about how to bring beauty in. The thing we did at the end, which kind of returned the color, we bundled the mandala, the ashes were all swept together and the petals all mixed in. And then the family took them up to the bridge, and there's a bridge over this just stunning creek. And so when it was smudged, pictures of them emptying this, this canvas bag into the creek. And then, of course, all the color came back with the petals.
Janie reads from the very end of the chapter, Excruciating Beauty.
Several feet below us, the group had gathered along the creek bank, beside the large pool of crystal clear water from the Cascade Mountains. I noticed that many were holding hands or had linked arms, and their faces were soft and beautiful. With the help of Jacqueline and Will, Doug opened the bag and slowly poured the petals and the ashes over the tree root ledge. Some ashes settled on top of smooth, round river rocks, where they shimmered in the late afternoon summer sun, and the petals rushed over the ledge, down the waterfall to the pool below, where the current shaped them into a wide crescent, almost touching the banks on either side. The circle of brightly colored petals seemed to be held suspended for several minutes before the gentle current of the pool slowly reshaped them into a column that carried them downstream, finally rounding the bend and disappearing from sight. A few petals were left behind, lodged between stones along the banks. They would likely rest a while, before eventually surrendering to the flow of water, perhaps under the darkness of night, lit only by the sliver of a new moon. Meandering down the path, arm in arm, to the feast that awaited us, Doug said with a steadiness to his voice, "When we can bathe our grief with beauty, everything feels easier." And when I think of Liz in the months since her ceremony, I think of her there, in the beautiful creek she loved so much, covered in a mountain of flowers.
You have been listening to Janie Brown in conversation with me, Carol Harmon, and reading from her book, Radical Acts of Love, How We Find Hope at the End of Life, which was published in 2020 by Doubleday Canada, a division of Random House. It may be ordered through your library or from your favorite bookstore. Visit callanish.org for details of Callanish Society workshops. Visit janiebrown.com to follow Janie's blog, which is hosted from her website. This program is also a podcast available on the Writers Radio website or wherever you get your podcasts. Heartfelt thanks to my fellow producers Ingrid Rose, editorial, and Gary Sill, music, audio, and website production. Special thanks to Jamie and all you listeners.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Sechelt Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.